When the call came, I thought it was a joke. An abandoned prison on the outskirts of town? Night watchman? The ad seemed too bizarre to be real, but the pay was good, better than anything I'd seen in a while. And I was desperate. I needed something, anything, to get me back on my feet after losing my last job. So, with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, I accepted. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. The prison sat alone at the edge of town, surrounded by acres of overgrown grass and dark trees. The crumbling stone walls loomed like a forgotten monument, its windows shattered and covered in a thick layer of grime. The main gate was rusted, barely hanging on its hinges, and the place had a feel of something that had been long abandoned by the world. But as soon as I pulled up, the eerie silence hit me. I parked near the front and stared at the building, feeling a cold shiver creep down my spine. It was midnight, the perfect time to start my shift, but something about the place felt off. There were no lights in the windows, no sign of life anywhere, the kind of stillness that made my skin crawl. The building had been closed down years ago, after a string of strange incidents had plagued the staff and the inmates. Rumors swirled around the place. Disappearances, unsolved deaths, whispers of something more sinister than just a rundown prison. It was all gossip, of course, and I had heard it all before. But now that I was standing there, alone at the gates, I wasn't so sure. The manager, a pale man named Greg, greeted me at the gate. He looked tired, his eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion you can only get from working odd hours in a place like this. He handed me a set of keys and gave me the rundown. "Your job is simple," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "Just make sure no one gets inside. Patrol the main areas, check the locks, and report anything unusual. The prison is vast, so keep to the main hallways. Stay away from the old cells, they're off limits, and don't wander off the beaten path. The place gets unpredictable at night." I nodded, trying to ignore the unease in my gut. I didn't know what he meant by unpredictable, but I wasn't in the mood to ask. As long as I stuck to the rules, it would be an easy job, right? The first hour of my shift was uneventful. I walked through the empty hallways, the flickering lights casting strange shadows on the cracked walls. The air was musty, filled with the smell of decay. Old papers and broken furniture littered the floors, remnants of the prison's last days. I passed by the empty cells, each one a cold, dark void that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The deeper I went into the prison, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't the quiet of an empty building. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, like the walls were listening. I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. There were no guards, no other staff, just me in this massive building that seemed to stretch on forever. I checked the locks on the doors, making sure everything was secure. But as I turned down one of the narrow corridors, I felt something shift in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with a noise, soft, almost imperceptible at first, a faint scraping sound, like metal against metal. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something, or someone, was moving through the halls behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the corridor, but it was empty. The sound stopped as soon as I turned, and for a moment I thought I'd imagined it. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I moved cautiously toward the sound, my flashlight cutting through the dark. I was about to turn the corner when I saw it, a shadow moving across the far wall. It wasn't the flicker of my flashlight or a trick of the light. This was something else. The shadow moved with purpose, as if it were alive. My heart raced. I stepped forward, my feet feeling heavier with each step. The shadow shifted again, disappearing into the dark as if it had never been there. I paused, listening, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me, but something inside me knew it wasn't a trick. I turned the corner, my flashlight scanning the empty hallway. There, lying on the floor, was an old, rusted key. It didn't belong to any of the doors I had checked, and it certainly wasn't a part of the set Greg had given me. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a cold chill sweep over me. As my fingers closed around the key, the lights flickered again, and the distant sound of scraping metal returned, louder than before. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping sound, like metal against metal, had grown louder, closer, almost suffocating. I stood still for a moment, listening to the silence that followed, but the hair on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. Something was wrong. I hadn't been imagining it. The shadow, the noise, they were real. But what was it? The hallway was empty. There was nothing there, just the cracked walls and the eerie hum of the failing lights above me. I stepped back, my breath shallow, the cold air of the prison seeming to wrap around me like a vice. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just the wind, or maybe some old machinery creaking in the distance. This place had been abandoned for years, but as I looked at the key still clutched in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of unease that had settled over me. The first rule of the job was clear. Stick to the main areas, check the locks, and report anything unusual. I had done that. But something about this place, the way the shadows moved, the way the air felt thick with secrets, it was getting to me. I glanced at the hallway. It stretched out in both directions, dimly lit and still. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I felt the hairs on my neck prickle, a cold shiver running down my spine. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just the isolation, I thought. Too many long hours alone in a decaying building. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly 1 a.m. I had at least a few more hours before my shift ended. I didn't want to linger here longer than necessary. So I started walking again, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The scraping sound came again, this time from further down the hallway. But it wasn't just the sound of metal, it was accompanied by something else. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The footsteps were moving toward me. Whoever, or whatever, was making that noise was coming closer. I turned, my feet suddenly unsteady, the floor creaking beneath me. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't know whether to run or keep walking, but I felt like if I moved, I would provoke whatever was following me. I had to stay calm. The footsteps grew louder, faster, almost as if something was sprinting toward me. My breath quickened as I turned to face the source. My flashlight beam swept across the hallway, but there was nothing, only the empty, oppressive darkness. I felt a cold rush of fear, my legs now refusing to move. I knew I had to check it out. There was no way around it. I had a job to do. I wasn't going to be scared off by shadows. I stepped forward slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I pushed open the nearest door. It led into one of the prison's main offices, and as I walked in, the stale smell of dust and mildew hit me in waves. The desk was overturned, the papers scattered across the floor, and the dim light barely illuminated the far corners of the room. I scanned the space, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. There was no sign of anyone here, no noise, no movement, just the silent remnants of a prison long forgotten. I was about to turn around and head back into the hallway when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just the scraping sound. There was something more, something like a whisper. The words were low, too faint to make out, but I could swear I heard them. A soft voice, cold and drawn out. "Get out." The whisper seemed to crawl into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, smothering any rational thought I had. My heart raced again, my instinct screaming at me to leave this room and never return. I had to get out of here. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling beneath me. But before I could make it back into the hallway, something moved in the corner of my eye. I froze, holding my breath as my flashlight caught the silhouette of a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall, shadowy, and its outline flickered in the dim light. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating the air around me. I blinked. The figure was gone. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was nothing. No one. The room was empty, and the air felt as still as ever. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by something unseen, wouldn't leave me. It was as if the room itself had shifted, as if it had become alive and was feeding on my fear. I didn't want to be here anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get back to the main entrance, call for backup, and get out of this place. But just as I turned toward the door, I heard the sound again. The scraping. Louder this time. Closer. And then I saw it. From the corner of the room, a shadow seemed to stretch toward me. It wasn't a person or a thing. It was something else entirely. The shadow moved like liquid, flowing across the floor toward me, its shape twisting and contorting as if it were made of smoke. I stumbled back, my hand grabbing for the door handle, but before I could make it to safety, the shadow reached out and my hand was on the doorknob when something cold and sharp wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back into the room. I tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat as a low growl filled the air. It wasn't the whisper anymore. It was something worse, something primal. I twisted and jerked against the cold grip, but it wouldn't let go. I couldn't see what was holding me, only the dark, suffocating presence that surrounded me like a cloud. The shadow was growing, enveloping me, and the last thing I saw before the lights flickered out completely was the faint glow of eyes. Eyes that were not human. My heart hammered in my chest as I twisted and jerked, trying to break free from the grip that held me. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the shadow wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into its suffocating presence. I could feel my body freezing, my pulse racing in my ears, but there was nothing I could do to escape. The growl grew louder, vibrating in the air like something alive, something hungry. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into complete darkness. For a moment, I thought I was going to pass out from sheer panic, but then a voice whispered, deep, guttural, and far too close. "Run!" It wasn't my own voice, it wasn't even human. The grip on my wrist loosened, just enough for me to break free. I yanked my hand back, stumbling away from the shadow, my pulse erratic as I tried to make sense of what was happening. My flashlight flickered back to life, casting a weak beam across the room. There was nothing. No one. The room looked like it always had, dim, dusty, and abandoned. But I knew better. Something had been there. Something had touched me. I spun around, scanning the room with the flashlight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness seemed to close in around me, pressing against my chest, and I felt the suffocating weight of whatever had been lurking just out of sight. I backed toward the door, my eyes darting to every corner. The growl was gone, replaced by a low hum, like the sound of air rushing through an unseen tunnel. But there was no time to think. I had to leave. I grabbed the doorknob again, my hand slick with sweat. The cold metal felt like ice against my skin as I twisted it, my mind racing. Get out now. The door opened, but as I stepped into the hallway, a sudden, overwhelming pressure hit me from behind. I whirled around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty, just the empty echo of my own breathing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the weight in the air wouldn't let me. Every sound was amplified now, the creak of the old building settling, the whisper of my footsteps against the cracked floor. It all felt wrong. And that's when I heard it again. The scraping sound, louder this time. It wasn't coming from behind me. It was ahead, far ahead, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, like claws dragging against metal. I froze. My eyes darted down the hallway, but I couldn't see anything. The prison stretched out in front of me, endless and dark. Every instinct told me to turn and run, but I knew I had to check it out. Whatever was making that noise, whatever had touched me, wasn't something I could ignore. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move, step by step, toward the sound. I moved cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. The scraping sound grew louder with each step, like something, or someone, was coming closer. I reached the end of the hall and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A door. It was old and rusted, its edges jagged like something had tried to force it open in the past. But that wasn't what caught my attention. The keyhole was glowing faintly, not like a light, more like something alive, pulsing in the darkness. I felt my chest tighten as I stepped closer, instinctively drawn to it. I shouldn't have. I knew better, but I couldn't stop myself. The glow from the keyhole was faint but unmistakable, and it seemed to grow brighter as I reached out to touch it. My fingers brushed against the cold metal. As soon as I made contact, the scraping noise stopped, replaced by a low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the floor, deep in the bowels of the prison. I pulled my hand away, heart pounding. The door groaned as if it were alive, and the rumbling beneath my feet intensified. Get away from it. The whisper was back, louder, clearer. This time, I recognized it. It was the same voice that had whispered, "Run." The same voice that had growled at me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a voice, it was a warning. I took a step back, but before I could turn to leave, the door jerked open on its own. I stood frozen, staring into the pitch-black room beyond it, feeling the oppressive weight of the darkness pushing against me. I shouldn't have gone inside. I knew it. But my feet moved anyway. My flashlight flickered once more, casting brief, erratic light across the space. And that's when I saw it. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, standing motionless in the center of the room. Its form was indistinct, like it was made of the darkness itself. But its eyes gleamed, 2 spots of glowing light in the pitch-black room. They locked onto me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The figure remained still, watching me, its eyes never leaving mine. And then, in a voice that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke. "Come closer." I felt the words vibrate through my body, pulling me toward it. My feet moved of their own accord, slow, heavy steps that carried me into the room. It wasn't until I was standing just a few feet from it that I realized what it was. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was something else. Its eyes were deep pits of blackness, like two endless voids, and the closer I got, the more suffocating the air became. I gasped for breath, feeling like I was drowning in the darkness. The figure tilted its head, its eyes narrowing. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice rough, like gravel grinding together. I couldn't answer. I couldn't think. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing against my chest, the air thick and suffocating. I reached out, as if to touch it, to see if it was real, but as my fingers neared its form, a cold shock ran through me. I recoiled, stumbling backward as the figure's form seemed to ripple, like it was made of smoke. My heart thudded in my chest as it took a step toward me, its mouth opening into a grin that stretched too wide. Before I could react, the ground beneath me shook violently, knocking me off my feet. The walls groaned, and the sound of cracking metal filled the air. Something was happening. Something was waking up. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight flickering out completely, leaving me in total darkness. I couldn't hear the scraping sound anymore, but something far worse was rising around me. The floor cracked open, and I felt a cold, damp breath on the back of my neck. Something was alive, and it was coming for me. The ground trembled beneath me, the air growing thick with an unseen pressure, as if the entire building were alive, shifting and groaning in response to something ancient. The figure that had once been nothing but a shadow now loomed before me, its presence swallowing everything. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the deafening sound of my heart pounding in my chest. Something was coming. Something terrible. I scrambled to my feet, my body feeling heavy, like the darkness itself was pulling me down. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. The cold air wrapped around me, suffocating and thick, making it harder to breathe. The walls felt as though they were closing in. My mind screamed for escape, but I couldn't move. Then, from the darkness, I heard it. The scraping sound. It was louder now, closer, like claws dragging against metal. It was all around me. I twisted, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but there was nothing. Only the overwhelming blackness. I was blind, trapped, and the growl that had begun to rumble from the depths of the prison reverberated through my bones. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that shook the air itself, like something beneath the ground was waking up, stretching, unfurling. My breath came in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I had to get out, had to leave before whatever was rising from the depths of the prison tore me apart. But when I turned to run, my legs wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but my voice got caught in my throat. I was frozen in place, my body refusing to obey. The growl grew louder, filling the air with its oppressive weight. It was no longer a distant sound. It was right in front of me, a low, guttural vibration that I could feel deep in my chest. The lights flickered back on for a moment, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. For a split second, I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, its hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was no longer just a shadow. It had form, substance. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that twisted and writhed unnaturally, like they weren't meant to move in the way they did. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. The figure's mouth opened, and the growl erupted again, louder this time, filling every corner of the prison. Its voice echoed, but not in any language I recognized. It was a sound of pure malice, a noise that crawled beneath my skin and made my bones ache. I had no choice but to run. I pushed myself forward, my legs finally moving again, but it wasn't enough. The shadow seemed to move faster, faster than any human could. I heard its footsteps behind me, slow at first, then picking up speed as it followed me down the hallway. I turned the corner, hoping to lose it, but it was right there. The figure was standing just ahead of me, blocking the path. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold, clammy sensation spread through me. It wasn't just watching me, it was studying me, waiting for me to make a move. "Why did you come here?" The voice was not human, not even close. It was an amalgamation of whispers, all speaking at once, overlapping and conflicting. But the meaning was clear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The growl rose to a deafening roar, and suddenly the figure lunged forward. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, far too long, reaching for me with claws that glistened in the dim light. I didn't think. I acted on pure instinct. I turned and bolted down the hallway, hearing the figure's footsteps grow louder behind me. The air seemed to get thicker, like it was trying to hold me in place. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. I could hear it getting closer. The sound of its claws scraping against the floor, its low growl rising with each step. I was almost at the exit, almost free, but the figure was faster, always just a step behind. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I grabbed the handle. It was locked. No, no, no. I turned the handle harder, but it wouldn't budge. The scraping sound was deafening now, the growl vibrating through the walls. I turned back, but there was no time. The figure was standing in front of me, its glowing eyes locked on mine. It smiled, a grotesque, twisted grin that stretched too wide, showing rows of jagged teeth. And then, in a voice that was both inside my head and all around me, it whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The thing was right in front of me now, its eyes gleaming with hunger, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, showing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. I could feel its presence press against me, suffocating the very air around me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body refused to move, as if the darkness itself was holding me in place. It grinned at me, that same twisted smile, and the growl rumbled low from deep within its chest. "You shouldn't have come." My mind raced. I had to get out. I couldn't let it get me. But as I stood there, frozen in terror, my legs refusing to obey, I felt the coldness of the prison's air tighten around me. The figure was so close now I could feel its breath, cold and rancid, brushing against my skin. The scraping sound had stopped, but now there was only the sound of its breathing, heavy and slow, as though it was savoring the moment. I tried again to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt like lead, and my throat was tight, choking on the fear. The figure stepped closer, its elongated limbs moving with unnatural speed. It was towering over me now, its eyes burning with an unnatural glow. The whispers in my head grew louder, and then, to my horror, the figure reached out. Its long fingers curled toward me, slow but deliberate, like it was savoring the fear in my eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. Its fingers brushed against my skin, cold as ice, and a jolt of pain shot through my body. It felt like it was pulling the very warmth from my soul, draining me. I gasped, my vision blurring at the edges, and the world around me began to spin. The growl in my ears became deafening, and the shadow of the figure seemed to grow, swallowing me whole. I couldn't breathe. The pressure was unbearable. But just as I thought I was going to collapse under the weight of it, a sudden burst of energy surged through me, like a shock to my system. My hand shot out, instinctively grabbing for anything to hold on to. My fingers brushed against the cold handle of the door. Without thinking, I yanked it open. The figure lunged, but I managed to slip through the doorway just in time, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, my back pressed against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I could feel its presence on the other side. I could hear it, scraping and scratching at the door, its growl vibrating through the thick wood. But it couldn't get to me. Yet. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. I had to get out of the prison. I had to find a way to escape. I ran down the hallway, not looking back, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The air felt suffocating, heavier than before. Every step I took echoed through the silence, but the sound of my footsteps was drowned out by the growls and hissing that seemed to follow me, reverberating through the walls. I could still feel the figure's eyes on me, as though it was watching me from the darkness, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I reached the main entrance, my pulse hammering in my ears. The door was still locked. I turned the key, but it wouldn't turn. The sound of the growl grew louder, more furious, like it was getting closer. I twisted the key harder, my hands slick with sweat, and finally, with a sickening click, the door swung open. I was free. Or at least, I thought I was. As I stepped outside, I felt the cold rush of night air hit me. But the relief was short-lived. The prison, or whatever dark force had been waiting for me inside, wasn't finished. I heard it before I saw it. The scraping sound, now deafening, as if the walls themselves were cracking open. The ground beneath me trembled, and I looked up to see something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in the doorway of the prison, its form silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow, and as it stepped forward, I felt the earth shudder beneath my feet. And then, in a voice that sent a chill straight through my bones, it spoke. "You cannot leave." I could feel my legs go weak as I stood there, staring at the figure in the doorway of the prison. Its eyes burned with that same unnatural glow, its mouth stretching into a grin that could only be described as a grotesque mockery of a smile. The scraping sound, sharp and grating, echoed from behind it like nails dragging against metal. The ground beneath me trembled again, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The figure stepped forward, its movement unnatural, like it wasn't meant to walk. Its limbs jerked, twisted, almost as if the body was fighting to stay intact. And yet, with every step, it grew closer, its shadow swallowing the dim light of the moon. "You cannot leave," it said, the words slithering out like a hiss vibrating through the air. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and sprint into the night, but my body was frozen, every nerve screaming for me to move, to escape, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the prison itself had some hold on me. The figure advanced slowly, its arms outstretched toward me. The distance between us was shrinking fast, and every inch it moved sent a ripple of dread through me. The growl behind it grew louder, deeper, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside my skull, vibrating my teeth. My head pounded, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. I could feel the air pressing in, suffocating me. I managed to force my legs into motion, but it felt like I was wading through water. My feet scraped along the ground, desperate to move faster, but the figure was too quick. It lunged at me, and I barely managed to stumble backward, my heart in my throat. I reached for the door, my hand shaking as I tried to pull it open, but it was stuck. The figure's hollow eyes were locked onto mine, its grin widening as it stepped closer, its presence engulfing me. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "Why are you here?" it asked, its voice now a twisted chorus of whispers, overlapping, mocking. "Why did you disturb us?" The words cut through my panic, bringing me back to the nightmare of this place. I had no answers, no explanation for why I had come here in the first place. I had just taken the job, desperate for money, for a way to pay my bills. But now, standing here, with this thing in front of me, I realized I'd been foolish to think it was just a job. There was something far darker at play. "Please." My voice barely broke free from my throat. I didn't mean to. The figure tilted its head, the movement too fluid, too unnatural, like something inhuman trying to mimic human gestures. "Oh, but you did. You woke it up." I tried to step back, but the darkness seemed to shift with me, closing in around me. The growl behind the figure was growing stronger, and I realized, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that whatever was behind it was waiting for me to make a move. I didn't know if it was human anymore. I didn't know if it had ever been human. Its shape twisted and stretched, its form flickering in the darkness like a bad dream. The walls of the prison seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, as if the very building itself was alive, feeding on my fear. The figure moved closer, its arm reaching toward me with unnatural speed. I tried to duck, but its fingers wrapped around my wrist, cold as ice. Its touch burned through my skin, and I screamed in agony, but the sound was muffled by the growl that rumbled from behind it. The world spun, my vision blurring as I tried to pull away. But it was no use. The prison was closing in around me. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. I didn't know what was real anymore, if anything was real. The figure grinned again, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction, and as it raised its other hand toward me, I realized, too late, that I had broken the final rule. Before I could react, the ground beneath me shifted. The building trembled violently, and the walls cracked open, like some terrible force was tearing it apart from the inside. The growl became deafening, filling every corner of my mind, and with one final pull, I was dragged into the darkness. Everything went black,